for me, I think this project is quite interdisciplinary. My background was, as Maria mentioned, I actually studied neuroscience originally, and then with some psychology, and I ended up kind of completely shifting into this when I started this PhD to do more social science research. I have just a little bit of information. I think Maria said everything about me that I was going to say. I'm in the third year of my PhD, so in Scotland that's our final year. And in Scotland we do our PhD by writing a thesis rather than, I know here you most commonly do it by publication, but we write a thesis. So I'm at the start of my third year, which means I've just finished my data collection, I finished my interviews, but I still have to kind of properly analyze that data and then write it all up. My research is funded by the Alzheimer's Society, so it's externally funded, which are a charity based in the UK. And my supervisors, I just thought it was important to tell you a little bit about their background. So Penny, who Maria mentioned, she collaborates with, Penny's a forensic psychologist, and she worked with the police, but now she is based at Abertay University in Scotland, and she does a lot of research around missing persons and kind of behavioural profiling for missing persons. Then my other two supervisors are Charlotte Clark and Heather Wilkinson. They are dementia researchers. So they do qualitative research with people with dementia, and their focus is on understanding the experience of living with dementia and how we can kind of support them to live safely and independently. In Edinburgh, I'm a part of the centre, it's called ECRED, and it's the Edinburgh Centre for Research on the Experience of Dementia. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's a research group that we have where we're, researchers, and there's also some people who are from third sector or social enterprise, and people living with dementia as well. We're all part of a kind of a group where we set our research agenda and what we want to achieve. So it's really important for us that the views of people with dementia are central to our research. Just a little bit of background. Has anybody heard of any of these reports? Yeah, a couple of people. So this is the Grampian report, and this is iFind, and these two are quite similar in that it's a statistical analysis. So Penny, one of my supervisors, was involved in this one, and they looked at police data on episodes of people who had gone missing and analysed the statistics of certain types of people. So that might be people with dementia, or it might be children with autism or schizophrenia, things like that. And so it acts as a search guide for, it gives timings and locations of where to search for people. iFind is a very similar report. It's almost builds on it using a wider set of data. So those are really interesting, and they're freely available online. This project is, so these were more police-led, but this project was a research project called the Geographies of Missing People. And it was the first project that kind of aimed to look at the experience of going missing and what that journey was from the perspective of the missing person. So they did interviews with returned missing persons. I think they used the word geographies because there was a real focus on the spatial aspect of their missing journey, where they went and why they went there and how long they went for. And then the findings of this kind of helped to develop police training, but also it was used by Missing Persons, the charity in the UK, to kind of train their volunteers as well. So sometimes I like to sell my project as a bit of a spin-off of this project, because this one didn't include the perspectives of people living with dementia. So that's what I aim to do. This slide is just to give you a little bit of an idea of how my research fits into the wider policy. So in Scotland, we have the National Dementia Strategy, and then we also have the National Missing Persons Framework. And the National Dementia Strategy was put forward to transform services and outcomes for people living with dementia in Scotland. The National Missing Persons Framework was generated to kind of, I think there were 4 main objectives. It was to prevent, to respond, to report, and to protect missing persons with quite a focus on vulnerable missing persons. And the reason why I just wanted to bring them to your attention is because in each document, I think they kind of acknowledge the importance of each other. So in the National Dementia Strategy, they talk about that adults who go missing is quite an important problem, and that people with dementia make up a large proportion of this. And they kind of acknowledge that they'll listen to upcoming recommendations because Police Scotland were doing a kind of their own study. And then National Missing Persons Framework, although there's not a lot of direct mention of dementia, it's really focused on vulnerable people, which is a category that people with dementia fit into. And I think the important thing that this framework highlighted is that missing is not just a policing issue, that it is a multi-agency issue. So, it tried to provide a framework of how all these agencies could come together. So, the aims of my project specifically. My research aims to understand the experience of going out and being at risk of going missing, but I kind of want to preface it with saying that my focus isn't on people who go missing. My focus is on just generally, what is it like to get out and about for people with dementia? So what are the challenges that they face? How do they overcome them? Do they use any interventions like tracking technologies, or do they go out using public transport? Do they go out alone with a partner? Some people still drive. And trying to really understand how people navigate, what happens when they get lost. Nobody's really asked that question to people with dementia. So it was trying to bring their voice into the evidence base a little bit. More broadly, as when you look beyond the missing, I was interested in how this experience affects people's sense of independence and control and kind of their sense of purpose in their own lives. One of the ultimate aims of the research is to find out, the more we know about someone's experience, then hopefully we can facilitate them to go out more safely, because the population of people with dementia is rising. There are more people living in the community with dementia, so we need to understand what their experience is like if we want to better support them. The text on this one is a little bit small, but this is just some background about the experience of going out with people with dementia. So it's kind of common sense, but going outdoors is an important part of living well for people with dementia, and it's an important part of living well for people without dementia. So I think that's important to say at the beginning, because there is an easy solution to preventing people with dementia going missing, and that's to not let them out. But that is a huge human rights violation, and so it's important to recognize that how important this is. But a consequence of having dementia is that they have poor topographical memory, which means that it can impact their ability to navigate, and they are at risk of becoming lost. And I think the difference with people with dementia and other populations is that people with dementia are at risk of becoming lost in even familiar environments. I remember one of my participants, he said if I get lost places, I only stick to my comfort zone. I only go places I know, because if I sometimes get lost in those places, what hope do I have if I go somewhere new? I think this is really important, is that the individual may or may not feel like they are lost. And I'll come back to this in a case study that I'll talk about later. But I think there's still the stereotype that people with dementia, they don't know where they are, they're confused, they've gone wandering. But actually, oftentimes that's not the case, even if they're reported missing. It's not all doom and gloom, because despite their elevated risk, majority of people are found safe and well. I guess there's another issue, is that if somebody does have a missing episode, or if their families are concerned about them, that can lead to preventative measures, such as restricting their ability to go outdoors, maybe even locking people inside, which then negatively impacts their quality of life. So that's a really important thing to consider. You know, very complex cases, they have a high mortality and morbidity rate. So that's all the more reason as to why there is, you know, when a person with dementia is reported missing, it's immediately a high risk case, and that's why I think the 24 hours are so important. Just to tell you a little bit about Scotland, so 2% of missing persons investigations involve people living with dementia. 2% doesn't seem like a high number, but that's 538 cases a year. And what I think is important is that that's just the number of cases that are reported to the police. And when I go out and I speak to people with dementia in the community, I know there's a lot of cases that don't get to that level. Maybe they find the person before it gets to that, but it's still happened and it's still a concern. So I would always take that with a pinch of salt. A little bit more specifically about missing incidents. So there is some research about people's behaviors. You know, people tend to go missing during routine activities, but it's difficult to identify kind of the behavioral cues, what leads to them then going missing. It can happen in a brief lapse of supervision. So maybe if they're with their partner doing something and their partner goes to the bathroom, often they'll come back to find that their loved one is gone. That, you know, the older someone is and the longer they're missing, the more likely they are to come to harm. People are usually found alive in populated areas and found dead in natural and isolated areas. And I suppose one hypothesis for this is that people in kind of areas where there's a lot of trees and places to hide, people can seek shelter, and that makes it more difficult to find them. People have a higher chance of survival if found within the first 24 hours, so that's why, you know, if a person with dementia is reported missing in Scotland, at least that's immediately a high risk case, and there's no limit to the resources that can be used. People are usually found close to home or the place that they were last seen, but I've had conversations with missing persons coordinators, and something that they say against this point is you can't assume that people with dementia don't travel far, because they might have really good mobility and they can walk really far, or these days it's so easy to jump on a train, or, you know, a bus driver, when you see an older person and you think they've just forgotten their bus pass, and you can let them on a bus and then there's no way of tracing where that person has gone. So I think that if you're searching for someone, it's an important thing to remember that you can't just assume that people with dementia can't get far, even if they do have poor mobility. This is just a quick overview of what I've noticed in the literature, and these are like maybe the main themes. The first one is specifically around dementia and missing, and we talked a little bit about features of missing incidents, and, you know, the Grampian report and the iFind, those are kind of tools that could be used to inform search strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about interventions and terminology. The other important aspect to this, I think, is around navigation and spatial orientation, and I'm not really going to talk about that today, but you know, from a neuroscience perspective, there's a lot of research around what happens in the brain when we navigate, and how are those processes impaired when somebody has dementia. So I think that's an important part of the puzzle. Finally, you know, people's risks, rights, their agency. There's a lot of literature and debate around how do we balance someone's, you know, right to freedom and independence with wanting to keep them safe. And there is no answer to that question. I suppose that's always going to be part of the discussion. The final point, number 4, is what's most important to me, and I've made it the same size as the other 3 points, but now that I look at it, I think it should actually be smaller, because that gives the impression that there's it's as dominant in the literature as the other points, and this point really isn't. And that's on the experience of being missing. So there is the Geographies of Missing Persons project, and there are a couple of There's one paper on the experience of carers when their loved one with dementia goes missing. There's some research about repeat adults who go missing, but not with dementia. But there's very little research that focuses on what it's actually like for people with dementia. I bring this one up because I think it could be interesting later in our discussion. And I don't know what it's like here in Sweden, but there's a big issue around the use of terminology. So there's literature around wandering in dementia, which now, at least for us in the UK, wandering is seen as a really negative term. And dementia advocates, they're really against the use of that term because it makes it seem like what they do is, you know, without purpose and aimless, and they just go out and they don't know where they're going. And they argue that that's not what it is when people with dementia go out, and you can't kind of label them with that. That's just a definition that's in the literature, the first point. But I think it's important to highlight that people with dementia, they can wander without getting lost, but they can also get lost and go missing without ever wandering. And I don't know what it's like here with using that word, but that word almost makes some people these days wince because it's such a taboo word, but there is literature on it, and so it is important to investigate. And people have come up with alternative words. I know there's wander walking, or some people suggest exploring. That's why for my project I just say going out, and I feel like that covers my basis to be able to encompass a broad range of things. But then on the flip side, there's missing, which is a much more specific term. The interesting thing about missing is like very little people who are reported missing actually identify with that term because they know where they were, or they don't feel like they were a missing person. Maybe they were missing to their family, but to them, they knew where they were. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but it's interesting to flag the differences in terminology and how that makes it quite difficult when you're trying to research the literature and the evidence, and you have to use all these different terms and know what's appropriate, because there's also, you know, elope or abscond. And interventions, I think, are an important part of this topic. So, you know, you have your search tools, you also have devices. This is a specific tracking device for people with dementia. It's called the Buddy. In Scotland, we have the Purple Alert, which is an app that it is a community-driven app. So it was developed by Alzheimer's Scotland in partnership with Police Scotland and people with dementia as well. And the idea is that as a everyday citizen, you can download the app and you can kind of set up a profile. But also, if I'm caring for someone with dementia, or if I am someone with dementia, I can download the app and set up a profile for myself. And if that person goes missing, you can report them missing on the app. And anybody else who has the app, who's within that kind of radius of where they're reported missing from, they'll get a notification and they'll get a lot of information about that person. So a picture and maybe places that they like to go. And it tries to involve the community in the search process. So this is done separately. You still have to call the police and report them missing. But I suppose it's just an added layer. And again, we can discuss later. I know that brings up concerns over privacy and ethics, you know, that if you have a vulnerable person's information just out there in the world, anybody could download and use this app, so anybody has access to that person, and if it's a vulnerable person reported missing, then could they become a target? Another intervention that we have in the UK that's starting to be spread out, it's not used across all of the United Kingdom, but people are rolling it out, and that's the Herbert Protocol. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. So it's basically just a paper sheet of information that carers are recommended to keep on the person with dementia. So it's just has all the information about him that you could possibly need. So the idea is that if I report a loved one missing and the police come to my door, I can just give them this document and be like, that's it, that's everything you need to know. That's what they look like, what they do, all the information you need. So it kind of takes the stress away from the carer a little bit when the police come and they have to take all their statements and take all that information that it's already there. There are also issues with that because, so right now it's a paper-driven document. It's not really held online. There's the issue of who holds this document. So right now it's just recommended that, as a carer you hold it at home, but what if a person with dementia lives alone? Nobody wants to kind of take responsibility because it's a lot of personal information about a technically vulnerable person. I know that in Canada they have a similar app to the Purple Alert. It's called Community ASAP. And I think that was actually modeled off of the Purple Alert app. And then I think there's an application here in Sweden, which, again, we can talk about a little bit later. I think if you're thinking about all these interventions critically, that there's really a lack of evidence base about what works and what doesn't. But I think that you have to have a little bit of leeway in this field because the practice is almost ahead of research in some ways. So they have to come out with interventions and try them and see how they work. So this is actually a picture that I took when I was doing my interviews. And I wish now, after your introduction, I wish I would have included more because I was really lucky that I got to go all over Scotland to interview my participants. Because, I mean, we don't have a similar climate to Sweden, but I guess we have similarities in terms of we have some really rural areas. So I went out to some of the islands and interviewed people out there because I think that the perspective of people who live rural and urban, it's been really different. Someone who lives in a small town versus someone who lives in a city versus someone who lives out in the countryside, they all have really different experiences. So I tried to capture all of those things. I did focus groups with people because I wanted to see whether people related to each other's experiences or whether they were different. And I guess I found both. In some cases people could really relate and in other cases they couldn't. So those focus groups one was with carers of people with dementia, and then I did two only with people with dementia, and I did two with carers and people with dementia. And that's always an interesting dynamic to see what people will share with me when they're with their partner versus when they're not with their partner or their family member. Then I would go on a walking interview with a person with dementia, and I would meet with people usually more than once, so we kind of developed a bit of trust. In Scotland, because of the way our kind of mental health act is, the Adults with Incapacity Act, I only had ethical approval to do research with people who had the capacity to consent. And I had to use process consent, which was my subjective assessment of whether that person could consent to research. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I can only speak to people who are just diagnosed, but you had to kind of get a feel for whether somebody understood what the research was about and what they were taking part in. It's kind of tricky because the Adults with Incapacity Act states that someone either has capacity or they don't, but I think we know with dementia that can fluctuate even from, within the space of 1 hour. So that was something that was tricky to navigate and to get all the ethical approvals in place. I used walking interviews because I thought they were a little bit of a more relaxed approach, and they really break down. I mean, I'm going to gush about them a little bit now for any researchers in the room, but I thought they were amazing because they really broke down that power dynamic. There's something about sitting across from someone in a room versus when you're out in open space, you're side by side, you're an equal. It was really contextually relevant because we were talking about navigating and going out, and there could be cues in the environment that people could point at, and they could tell me when I see that church there, I know that it's time to turn left. Things that I don't think would have come up in a traditional interview style. I also interviewed their care partners because I think that is an important perspective to gain as well. So although my focus was on the experience of people living with dementia, I don't want to neglect that their carers, their spouses, their family their perspective is important to this too. The reason why I used walking interviews, which I've kind of spoken about before, but I think you have to be a little bit flexible when you're doing research with people with dementia, and this method kind of allows you to do that. The other thing that it allowed me to do was tell people, you show me around, you take me on a trip that you would usually do. So it gives them control over the interaction. I know there are limitations. You've got to consider Mother Nature. Like, I would usually just use a lapel mic to record the interviews, and there were some circumstances where the audio quality was terrible and it was horrific to try to transcribe it. But generally, I think it captured a lot of interactions that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. This slide is almost kind of like emerging findings for me. I am at this stage now where I've finished all my data collection, but I haven't formally begun my data analysis. So I don't want you to take these as these are the key findings of my research, because I'm not at that stage yet, but these are definitely themes that came up time and time again, and I think that they're important to share. The first one around resilience and coping strategies, I found that people were surprisingly capable of, if something didn't work for them, that's okay, they would try something else. Like the gentleman I mentioned earlier, he still likes to drive. When he retired, he bought a nice new car. He got diagnosed with dementia, so he downgraded to an easier to drive car, and he has all these strategies now. He doesn't drive at night, he doesn't drive in the bad weather, but he still drives, so he still maintains that level of independence. People walking along the same route, it's still important to them to go out, so they come to the conclusion with their partner, okay, you can go out, but you have to walk that route, and I know how long it takes you. So, someone would say to me that I know this route takes him 40 minutes, so if he's gone for longer than 40 minutes, I start to get worried. This wee book rules my life. We is small in Scotland, that's what people say. People would have a little book with them, and it would write down everything, the bus they were getting, where they were going, and have it in their pocket with them, so that it was a strategy for them to be able to still stay independent and get out, and they could look at what their schedule for the day was. Someone said, the next time you see me, I'll probably have one of those tracker things. So people were very open. And when I asked people, interestingly, not a lot of my participants had trackers, but a lot of them were open to the idea of using them, because I know we have this big debate around what about the ethics and the safety, but what I found was people were like, yeah, if it means I have more independence and I can go out more, then I'll wear a tracking device, I don't mind. Changes in environment were really important. I think this is an important point for, if you're someone who searches for people with dementia, is that one person told me that scaffolding on a building can be really disorientating for them because the environment has changed. Another participant told me that when he goes to his local train station every day, it's an easy route for him, it's straight down the road. One day he came out of the train station and there was a lot of trees and they had all been cut down, and that was really disorientating for him. His whole environment had changed, and he just turned around and went home because he couldn't, even though it was such a direct route that he took every day, that change just was overwhelming for him. Things like uneven surfaces, can affect people's balance. We were talking earlier about roadworks. Any of those changes can be disorientating for people. And then that links into signage and landmarks. The signage was actually something that was really important to people. And there's a lot of modern signs these days that aesthetically look really pleasing, but are tricky to decipher what they're actually saying. So, people say that they like to see kind of black writing on a yellow sign, something that's really clear and easy to see. And landmarks, people used landmarks. So if they saw a church or if they saw a local shop, and once they saw that, they knew that was their cue to turn or to keep going. There was one woman, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Edinburgh, but in Edinburgh, we have a big castle, on a hill, and it's almost wherever you are in the city. If you just look up, you can see it. And there was one woman, and she was always looking up, and her daughter said to her, like, "What are you doing? What are you looking for?" And she said, "I'm trying to see the castle, because when I see the castle, I know where I am in the city." Another thing is that people's abilities can fluctuate. You know what I was saying about their capacity to consent. It's the same with their abilities. You know, one participant said, "I have good and bad days. Some days I'm, you know, perfectly able to go out on my own. Other days it's a lot more challenging for me." So we can't just take a person with dementia as this is what it's like for them, because it changes every day. How other people reacted to them was really important. Some people thought that, like, there's still a stigma and that they weren't comfortable asking people for help. They didn't trust anyone. But then I don't want to say that that was what everybody told me, because some people said, "No, I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable telling someone I have dementia." We have a lot of like little help cards. I don't know if you have them here, but they kind of just say, "I have dementia. Please help me," or something like that on them. So people would use them, and people would be quite confident to show them to people, and not be afraid to disclose that. I don't know whether that's because they feel comfortable now that there's less of a stigma. Other people were kind of willing to ask for help, but they'd be careful about it. So they said that you know, they would look for someone in a uniform, and they would ask them for help, or a little old lady. They would ask a little old lady for help. And I had a really interesting conversation yesterday, and they were telling me that in Sweden, like, people, you know, in the UK, I guess people have strict uniforms for certain job roles, so it's really easy to identify what they do based on what they wear. And someone was telling me on Sweden, dress is a lot more kind of casual, which might make it a little bit more difficult to identify who's a person that I could go to and ask for help. Finally, the sensory impairments, I guess that kind of links in with the changes in environments, is that, you know, dementia is not just memory loss, and different types of dementia can mean that people have different impairments. I had a couple of participants who their memory was perfectly intact, but they had serious sensory impairments which impaired their ability to kind of navigate and get around. So, you know, a lift can look like, or a puddle in the ground can look like a dark hole for some people. Noisy environments, or being in a car where things are rushing towards them, could be like, one participant said he just had to close his eyes, that in a busy street you just have to look down, and then that affects your ability to know where you're going. So yeah, there was a lot said about people's vision and hearing as well. I just wanted to share this case study because, like I said, I don't have such concrete findings yet, and hopefully what you can take away from today is some sort of anecdotal evidence that might, especially when you're doing searches, that might inform them. This one gentleman, he's 65 years old, so he was quite young. He was retired and was diagnosed with dementia for about a year or two ago, so quite recently diagnosed. He lived at home with his wife, and she worked part-time. So he had a career in the army and in emergency services planning, so he was a very routine-orientated kind of person. He still drove, and he loved going out walking, and he would go out walking on his own every day. On our walking interviews, he took me for the longest hikes. We would go for like 2-3 hours. And he was really socially active. He had a reason to get out of the house every day. Some of the challenges for him, though, were in driving. Like, he would forget where he parked the car. He would have sometimes where he'd have to pull over because he wasn't sure where he was, even if he was only 5 minutes away from his home. He did get lost a couple of times, and he was reported missing once by his wife. But what actually happened was he had gone out for a long cycle and forgotten his mobile phone. He got a puncture and had forgotten a puncture kit as well. He had cycled so far from home, and he was so angry at himself that he had forgotten these things that a couple of people stopped and offered to help him, but he didn't accept their help because he was punishing himself. And he was gone. He said he'd be gone for 4 hours, 8 hours later, and he wasn't back. So his wife called the police, and they went out searching for him, and eventually he came home that night, was scolded, but he was home, he was safe. But the important thing about that story is that he was reported missing, but he was never lost. He knew where he was. And I think that's something we have to remember with people with dementia. This person, although his memory seemed relatively intact, again, like I said earlier, he had these sensory impairments. There was once where on our interview, he nearly stepped out in front of a car because it was a grey day, it was a grey road, it was a grey car, and he didn't see the car coming. I mentioned him earlier, so he came up with strategies. He found ways to manage his risk with his driving, an easier car and driving at certain times. When he knew that getting lost was an issue, and he knew that walking was so important to him, so he would stick to specific walking paths. In the area that he lived in, there was loads of different walking paths, really well defined, so he would always stick to the ones that he knew. He was looking into getting a tracking device as well. Again, not for him, but because it made his wife happier, and if it meant he could go out and she would be happier, then he wanted to use it. And to manage the memory problems that he had, he would stick to this really strict routine, and maybe that relates back to his, previous career in the army. He was really able to. He had a whiteboard that he would write every day what he did, and so strategies so that he wouldn't forget things, as everything had a specific place to help him. I think that the most important lesson from this case is that, I've called him Jim, it doesn't matter. Even though he was never lost, he was still reported missing, and it was still a traumatic experience for him, and especially for his wife, who I also spoke to, that she has a lot more anxiety now about him being out alone, but she knows that that's something that's so important to him, and so she's trying her best to support it. So I think we can't assume that every case of people with dementia reported missing involves them just, not knowing where they're going, and they go wandering, and they're lost and disorientated. Is that you could consider a person with dementia as a normal missing person as well, and you don't have to apply as many special tactics, or you shouldn't jump to these conclusions. And that's why interventions like something like the Herbert Protocol could be really useful, because there are so many different types of dementia, and they impact so many different people in different ways. And I think sometimes we can't help but think, you have that image of what dementia is in your head, but actually it can be so different depending on each person. So just to be aware of that when you are searching for someone with dementia. Something that I'm hoping is that my research findings can lead towards almost a guidebook, just a comprehensive short guidebook for Police Scotland, and I've been in communication with them to try to develop something, so hopefully a strategy where I can bring my findings to them, and we can kind of develop something together. That could be used by, Police Scotland, it could be used by search advisors, because I think that when you're conducting a search, it's your job to put yourself in the shoes of that person and think like how they would think. So the more we know about their experience, the more it can, improve somebody's ability to do that. Maria mentioned at the beginning that we've set up a kind of consortium. So luckily I was just put in touch with another PhD student in Canada, and I found it was when I was kind of doing the literature review for my research, I was thinking like there's all these little pockets of research happening around the world, but because this is something that's so practical and can have such immediate impact, I felt like there was no platform for all this research to be shared and communicated. And then luck would have it, on Twitter I came across this PhD student who was doing a similar project and had similar issues, so we thought we'll just start a platform. So we, she got some funding and I got some funding, and we developed the International Consortium on Dementia and Wayfinding. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but we had a real challenge in using the right terminology, because we didn't want to use the word wandering because that wasn't acceptable everywhere. We didn't want to use the word missing because I don't think that encompassed the broader picture. So we've gone with wayfinding. And we have a website that should be launched in the next couple of weeks, actually. And the idea isn't that this is like just a group for researchers to talk to other researchers. The idea is that that people from all different backgrounds are involved. So these are some pictures from our meeting in Edinburgh and in Canada. And there were researchers there were people living with dementia there were police officers there were people there from third sector, from the Alzheimer's Society. And it was just an opportunity to bring everyone together, everyone to the table, and be like, how do we address this issue? How do we all come together? So it's hoped that this website will kind of be a platform where you can just learn, and there'll be a list of everybody who is a member, and that you can reach out to different people, you can find out all the different research projects that are happening. So that's the next step for us in terms of trying to make our research have some impact. That is everything. Those are my references. I'm happy to share slides if anybody wants them. And that is my contact information. So thank you very much for listening.